To wrap up this tutorial, what I want to do is focus on a little demo of using our seeder class that we wrote throughout the tutorial. And to do that, what we're going to do is create a seeder that does the double insert or the dependent insert that we saw while we were writing the tutorial. So that's when we seed one collection and then we seed another based on the result of that previous collection. And to demonstrate that, we're going to seed the Meteor users collection with fresh users, and for each user we're going to create a set of documents for that user. And so to make sure that this works, what I've got up here in front of me is in the imports API, and this is documents directory inside of base. I've opened up the documents collection definition, and here we've got the schema for that collection. So by default it does not have an owner field. Base does not include this, so what we're doing here is adding that so that when we go to insert documents we can assign them to a specific user ID, and then that way back in the UI we can recall them. So we're only doing that for test purposes here. We're not wiring up the full implementation of that in base, but just so you know, we're adding this extra owner field, and if you're working from a bare copy of base you will not have this, so make sure to add that in. Two other things we're doing. First is we're setting up a publication to list out our users. So we're kind of working backwards here. So don't worry, we haven't skipped over anything. We're kind of going from back to front to make sure that this is all clear. So what we're doing here is setting up a publication, and that publication is just called utility.users. And all this is doing is returning two MongoDB cursors if our current user is in the role of admin. So we're using the A landing roles package here that's built into base, and what it's saying is, okay, if the currently logged in user is an administrator, go ahead and return these two cursors. Otherwise, just return nothing. Don't send any data down to the client. And the two cursors that we're returning are meteor.users.find and documents.find. Because we're not specifying any queries here or any specific fields or anything like that, we're just going to get the entirety of both of these collections. This is good for demo's sake. We're not too concerned about performance or anything here. We just want to showcase how the seeder works. So keep that in mind. If you're going to use this exact pattern, you're going to want to tweak the parameters here a little bit depending on what your UI needs to do. But for us, we're just saying, like, give us everything. We want the whole list of users, and we want the whole list of documents that are in the database. So that's part one. We're creating this publication, and just so that's clear, that's an imports API utility server publications.js. So again, imports API utility server publications.js. The other file that we're going to create is the most important one for this demo, which is methods.js file, and this you'll see lives right alongside that publications file that we just created inside of imports API utility server. And so what's going on in here is we're setting up two methods. So we've got utility.seedUsers and we've got utility.resetUsers. And so the first is the most important. What's going on here is we're using the seeder method that we wrote throughout the rest of the tutorial. And so this is the class here, class seeder. Remember that down at the bottom here we exported a default function that wraps a new instance of our seeder. So we're now taking that function and importing it up here at the top of our methods.js file. We're saying, okay, pull in seeder from that module, and now we're going to actually put it to use. So by putting it to use, what we mean is we're defining the seeder, and remember that the first argument that we always want to pass is the actual collection instance. So this is a MongoDB collection instance that we're passing as the argument. We don't want to pass something like users, just a string referencing what collection we want, or a string referencing meteor.users. We don't want to do that. We want to pass the exact collection instance. And the reason we want to do that is because inside of our seeder class, remember that we're invoking things like .find, .count, and these are only accessible to us via the actual collection instance. So we wouldn't be able to do this by referencing a string or anything like that. We need the actual instance. So that's why we're passing that here as the first argument to seeder. Now the second argument is a little more complex. This is our options object. And remember that the options object kind of tells us what exactly we're doing with this collection. So we know we're trying to seed meteor.users, but under what conditions and what data are we seeding it with, is what the options object is going to answer. So the first argument that we've got here, the first property I should say, is environments. And remember that we do an environments check inside of our seeder check. So environment allowed, we check to see if the current node environment, remember this is an environment variable that's set for us. We can control this through environment variables, but it's generally set for us by our host to say either development, so on localhost, so on my computer here, this is currently development, but once we deploy our application to production, this would change to production or master or something like that. But what we're doing is we're checking to see if the values in this array match the current, any of the values in that array match the current node environment. So effectively what we're doing is if the current environment is production, is it in this array? That would answer no or false, and so this seed would be blocked because we're just returning the response to that here. And remember, back up in our actual so method, so is what gets called ultimately by the seeder to do the seeding of the collections. We check and say, is this environment allowed? If it returns false, not, then none of this code ever runs. So it's effectively blocking the seed from ever taking place. And also remember that if we do not pass an environments argument or property here, so environments, if this is not present, the seeder just doesn't run at all. And so that's a safety mechanism, again, to prevent us from accidentally seeding or deleting or doing any dangerous data work to a collection that we didn't mean to. And so always double check when you're using the seeder that you've got the correct environments. Don't just copy and paste and kind of skip around, because that could bite you in the butt later. So make sure that you've specified not just an environments property, but pass to that environments property is the correct array of environments that you want your collection to be seeded in. So next property we've got here is NoLimit. And then NoLimit, again, is just saying we don't want to check whether or not documents already exist in this collection. And so we can see that here and check for existing data. Actually, it's up here. When we do has data, when we define this variable that we check down here right next to environment allow, we're saying if options.nolimit has data is false. Even if the collection actually does have data, we're just using this option to say skip that check, we're not going to worry about it. So if options.nolimit isn't present, then we do go ahead and check for existing data, but in this case we don't care, we're just going to seed our documents collection willy-nilly and not really worry about it. So that's what that's doing here. It's just making sure that we don't bump into any existing data preventing our seeder from running. Now these two are kind of are buddies. So what's going on here is ModelCount is specifying the number of iterations that we want to run or use this model method that we've defined here. And so remember, the model method is a little bit different than the other property that we can pass, which is just a static data array of objects. So if we were seeding a documents collection, we could have, my test document here. So the data array is literally just static data. We've predefined it, and we just want to insert only that data and nothing else. But for this example, we want to dynamically generate data. And so we can use the model method that we defined inside of our seeder class to do this for us. And so what that's going to do is say for each iteration, so we have 5 possible iterations. For each iteration, we're going to call this function model, and that model function is returning an object. So notice that object here contains one user with an email address equal to user plus user count at test.com. So for each iteration that we're calling this, we're going to call it 5 times. So we're going to have user count be the current index plus 1. So we're doing this because the user count, or I should say the index, is going to be 0 based. So we don't want user 0 at test.com. We want to say user 1 at test.com, just to make it a little more clear. And so we grab the user count based on that index. And so remember, in our seeder, when we go over our loops, we're using this simple for loop here. If we detect that this is not an array, so we do the is data array check up here, we're saying, oh, okay, it must be a model method. So we invoke the model method, passing the index of the current loop. So we're saying the current iteration, we pass that index number, and then we also pass an instance of faker. And again, faker is that library that we're using to generate fake data. So we just pass it from within Cedar, just so that we don't have to import in every single file where we're trying to use our Cedar. Little convenience for our user's sake. So we've got that index and we've got faker. So now what we're doing is we're generating a first name for this user, and we're using faker.name.firstname. And so this is built into that faker library. And I've displayed the URL for the documentation for this at the bottom of the screen. There's tons of methods for that, so you can really play to your heart's content with it and generate a lot of fun fake data. In this case, though, we just want to generate a first name. And the reason we're doing this up here is because notice we're going to reuse this twice. So we're using this in the user's profile data. So we're going to pass this as their first name, and we're using ES 2015 shorthand here. So this is equivalent to just doing first, but because it's pretty redundant, we can just get rid of that, and ES 2015 knows to assign the property of first on this object to the value of this first variable here. And so first, again, here, is used once in the profile, and then down here, this is when we're getting into our dependent data. So remember, dependent data is checked when we go to actually create our data. So in this case, we're creating a user, and we say if user to create has a .data method, then we want to call this .seed dependent on our class, passing in, remember, the data ID or the ID of the document that we just created, along with the options for that dependent seeding. So in this case, we're passing the user ID that we just created, and we're passing the data that we've specified back here inside of our data method. So this behaves pretty similar to our model method. So model is just returning an object. Here, data is returning an object as well, except the difference is that we're taking in a user ID first, or a document ID, whatever kind of version of this we're doing. We take that in, and then we're saying, okay, go ahead and seed that document, or create the document seed using this user ID and the first name that we created up here. And so document seed is a function that we've written up here, and all that's doing, it's just returning an object for us with all of the requirements for our dependent seed. And so this is dependency, we mean this is the seeding that's going to happen after the user is created. So once we have a user, we're going to call this returning the rules for that next seeding. So we create the user first, then we want to seed the documents collection. And so the rules for that are saying, okay, take in the user ID that we're going to add these documents for and their first name. And so we specify a collection property, again passing a MongoDB instance of a collection. So in this case, our documents collection that we've imported up at the top here. We specify which environments we want this dependent seeding to occur in. And again, all of these rules still apply. There's the parent iteration, the parent seeding doesn't block this at all. So you want to make sure that you still specify which environments this dependent seeding is going to occur in. So in this case, still development and staging. Again, no limit. We don't want to check if the documents collection has anything in it yet. We're just going to add documents. For the documents, though, that we are creating, we're going to say we only want to create 2 for each user that we create. So down here we can see we're creating 5 users. Each user is going to have 2 documents owned by that user. So ultimately, when we run this, we want to get 10 documents in the database, 2 for each user. And so we set our model count to 2, then we're calling model again. And this time we have the index. So we're just calling this data index, but this is still the index of the model iteration. So for each loop, we're passing that I value or the index value. So that I there is equal to the I that we're getting here from our loop. So it's just the exact same one, except we're at the nested level now. So we're at the sub level of we've created our user, now we're creating the documents for that user. This is the next loop. And remember, when we do seed dependent, all we're really doing is recalling our entire seeder method from the beginning. The only difference is that we're calling it down here and fetching what data we need to seed the new collection with. So we're just restarting the process again for each nested value. So technically speaking, if you set the rules correctly, you could do this indefinitely. So if you have, for some reason, 5 collections that are dependent on each other, you could do this nested 5 times. Your code might look a little messy, but it would technically work. So that's all that's happening. We're just rerunning the seeder again and again and again until we hit the end of our dependent seeds. In this case, we just have the simple version of this, so just 2 levels. And so we're calling our model, and we're returning what's ultimately going to be the document that's going to be inserted into the database. So we're going to run this twice, and so what we're doing is we're creating 2 documents for this user ID. And again, user ID is coming to us here, which ultimately comes to us from here. So again, the data method specifies that we have dependent data for this first set of data that we created or seeded the database with. And now for each iteration of that, we're getting back a user ID, which we're now passing along to this document seed method. And back here, we're putting that to use by saying, okay, for each document, apply that user ID that we're taking in as the owner field of that document. Whew, that's a lot, right? So again, user ID is coming into this, we're applying it as the owner, and ultimately that's coming back from each iteration of the dependent seed returning the user ID of the created user that's triggering this dependent seed. Pause for a second and think about that. So we've got our user ID, we've got our document, and again we're using that first name value that we created down here. So that's why we stored it behind a variable, because we use it here and then we pass it along to our document seed function here so that we can just identify the document. So we're saying first name, so George's document number, and then whatever the iteration is. So George document number 1, George's document number 2. And then we'll have the body of the documents. We actually won't even use the body in this case. We're only going to list out the titles. And we'll see that in a few minutes here. So that's our method for seeding users. A little more simplistic, down at the bottom is our second method that we've created, which is utility.resetUsers. And so reset users is simply doing what it says. It's literally wiping out the users collection, and it's wiping out the documents collection. And the way that we're doing this is a little tricky because we don't want to wipe away our administrative user, which is the one we'll be logged in with to view all of this stuff. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, give us all of the users where the user or the email address is not equal to admin@admin.com, which is our dynamically generated administrative user in base. And then we're saying use the _.pluck method to grab only the ID property of each of those users. So this is going to return an array of strings equal to the ID of each user that we found. So in our case, because we know that we're creating 5 users in our database, ultimately our database will have 6 users, but we're only getting 5 of them because we're excluding the admin. This will be an array of 5 strings, and all we're doing is saying, okay, for the documents collection, find all of the documents and remove where the owner field is in this array of user IDs. So if we have a match for a user ID on the owner field, so any user ID in this array that we're passing here equals any documents owner field, that document will be removed. And same exact concept for users. We're just saying, okay, where you find a user ID matching the ID of that user document, go ahead and remove that user. So that's all that's doing. And this is purely for test sake. Generally speaking, you won't even need this. This is just so we can demonstrate kind of the back and forth between wiping the collection and seeding the collection. But keep this in mind. This may be useful for you later, if you want to have an easy way to wipe out users and some dependent data that they have. So with this in mind, let's move seeder over here. I want to make one more note before we get into listing all this stuff out. So here I've got the imports. This is startup server API.js file open. And what this is this is us telling Meteor, and more specifically Meteor server environment, that we want to import or include the methods that we just defined here in methods.js, as well as the publications that we set up. So in utility server, we have publications as well. We want to tell our API about that, because if we do not include these 2 lines, the code that we just wrote won't even work. Meteor will throw an error and say, I can't find the method name that we defined. So utility.seedUser. So this is just a friendly note. Make sure that you add these 2 lines to import those files that we created into API.js. And so just so it's clear, API.js is loaded into index.js, which is ultimately loaded into server main.js. So right here we've got import startup server. This is aliasing index.js. So this import automatically assumes if we don't pass a file name at the end of this, we're either pointing to a file called server.js or we're looking in a directory called server for a file called index.js. So more you know. Hopefully that doesn't ruin your day, because it's very easy to forget to do this. So we've got everything wired up. We've got our methods. We've got our publications. So we're ready to go on the client side. And to do this, what I've done is I've set up a quick route here in our or in base, and we've got this right here. I almost lost it. So we've got users, and so users is pointing to a component. We haven't created this yet. We're working backwards here. So this users component that I'm importing here, and this is going to be a page component. We're just going to display a simple page of users. And so we're importing this from UI pages users. So just so you know, import that, make sure that you have a route so we can get to this. And this is just in the browser. We would go to localhost 3000/users or the domain of your app /users. So let's close that up, and now we've got our component. And so this is pretty simplistic. All we've got here is a stateless functional component called users, and stateless functional just means that we don't have any of React's state or lifecycle methods defined on the component. We're not going to use them, so instead of adding all of that extra weight into our file, we're just simply saying all we need to do is return some markup, and that markup is going to render some props. That's what a stateless functional component is for. If we needed more than this, like we did need access to state and we did need access to lifecycle methods like componented mount, then we would use the ES 2015 class version of this. But for now, we're just listing out some data, so we don't need to be terribly complicated with this. So we have our component users, and what's going on in here is that we've just got a header and we've got two buttons. So we've got reset users and seed users, and all these are calling to the respective methods on the server. So on click of reset users, we call this handle reset method, which again calls to meteor.call utility.resetUsers, the one we just defined up on the server. And conversely, seed users here, this button is calling handle seed, which is up here. Same exact idea, it's just calling utility.seedUsers, that method we defined first on the server that actually triggers our seeder method to seed the collections. And so down below all of that, we're actually looping over some data. So we'll look at how we're getting this data in a second, but just know that we're looping over each of the users that we return. For each user, we're just going to output their first and last name, and then we're going to list a table of their documents. And so notice here that for each user, we've got this documents field, and we're going to see how we do that next. But we loop over each user, output their name, and then we output their documents. We loop over the documents we have for them, and then for each document we're just adding a table here, and we're adding a new table cell with a link to that document. That's all we're doing. So how do we get this data? So down here at the bottom we're using, in base we rely on a package called React Composer. This is version 2 of React Composer, to fetch data for us and reactively pass that as props down to our component. And so in base, we have this method here, you'll see container, and we're importing this up at the top from modules inside of base. So let's close a few things up here, and we'll see modules, and we've got modules container. And so all this is doing is, this is just a helper function that we've written into base because we didn't want to write this code every single time somebody wanted to use a container. That creates a container for us. So what it's doing is it takes in a function that loads all of our data for us, and then it also takes in a component, and that component is the component that we're wrapping with our data. So we're literally creating a container around a component. And so back here in users, we're creating a container or a wrapper around the users component that we've defined up above. And so we take in a function that's going to handle our data, and then the component that's receiving that data. So in this case, the users component that we're defining up here. So ultimately we want to get a user's prop available to this component. And to do that, we subscribe to that publication that we set up on the server, so utility.users, and again that returns all of the users and all of the documents in our database. And we say once the subscription is ready, we do a little more trickery using underscore here. So we've got a variable users, and what we're doing is using the underscore.map method. And so just so this is clear, up top we're importing underscore from the Meteor underscore package, and that's already installed in base, so you don't have to worry about that. And so we call underscore.map, and what we do is map is expecting an array as its first argument. So here we're saying find all of the users. So on the client side, if we've subscribed, we expect our publication to have sent users down to the client. So in the client side copy of meteor.users, find all of the users where their underscore ID value, or their user ID, is not equal to the current Meteor user ID. And we do this so that if we log in as the administrator, which is what we're logged in as for this demonstration, we don't want to display that user. We only want to display the test users that we're creating. And so once we have that data, we call .fetch to get this back as an array. And again, .map here, underscore.map, is expecting an array as its first argument. So we get an array of objects, and each of those objects is representing a user. And so for each user, we're calling a function here. And so we're just using a little bit of ES 2015 shorthand. If this looks weird, this is known as an implicit return. And so an implicit return is when all the function that we're passing is doing is it's just returning something. We can remove the return keyword and the braces around our function and just directly return the value that we're trying to return. And so in this case, what we're doing is we're returning an object for each iteration of this array that we're passing. So we're passing an array of users, and so for each user in our database, we're looping over and we're saying, okay, for each user, what we're going to do is spread, or use the spread operator. And this is, again, this is more ES 2015 stuff. This is an ES 2015 feature that says, okay, take this value, and we expect it to be an object, and we want to spread or expand the value of that object onto this new object. So what we're literally doing is expanding or unpacking, is maybe a good way to think about this user object onto the new object that we're creating here. And so literally, like if you ever visit a hotel, you unpack your suitcase into the drawers of the dresser that they give you in the hotel. Same exact idea. We're unpacking our data or unpacking our clothes into that dresser. And that dresser here is this object that we're creating. So the trickery for us comes when we say, well, for each user, we're trying to list out the documents that that user owns in the application. And so instead of having a bunch of different variables here and having to call to multiple collections and handle all this messy combination of data inside of our component, we can just say, okay, go ahead and give us a documents field for each user that we're looping over. And so underscore.map is literally returning a new array of objects based on what we return it here. So we're getting back an object now that has all of the properties of that user, as well as all of the documents that we found owned by that user ID. So each user we're looping over, we're checking their user ID against an owner value in the documents collection. So any documents where the owner field is equal to the current user being looped, their ID value, we're going to get those back. And then again, we're using fetch to get those documents back as an array. So when all is said and done, we're going to get an array back of user objects, but now each of those user objects are going to have a documents value, which is just an array of the documents that they have in the documents collection. So we take users then, this variable, and we pass it to this object here, and onData is React Composer's method for assigning props to the component that we pass here. And so we'll have a users prop inside of our component now that's equal to the users found and all of the documents found. So again, now we have users as a prop. We're just looping over each user. They have this new documents value, so we grab the first and last name of the user that we're looping over. Then we have their documents, and we output those at the same time. So that is the entirety of our demo code. So now let's have some fun. So over here, I've already generated a few users to test. But this will be a good test of our full kind of setup here. So remember, we've got seed users as an option, and we've got reset users. So because I've already got some data here, I'm going to click reset users. That's going to wipe both the users collection for all of the users that are not our administrator, as well as all of the documents matching those users that weren't administrators. So now, the grand finale, we click Seed Users, and notice we created 5 users, each user getting 2 documents to themselves. And we can tell that these are their documents because remember, we passed the first name of that user along when we created their documents. So we know, okay, so we've dynamically generated these names again using that Faker package. So Carly has 2 documents. That's a name. Murtis has 2 documents. Herman has 2 documents. So we can guarantee that, okay, each of these users was created with their own documents. And so again, we can reset. We've wiped that collection out. They no longer exist. And we know that's working because, remember, our component is just pulling data from the publication. So whatever the publication is returning, our component is displaying. And in this case, there's nothing in the database for those that's not admin users, so we're not seeing anything. So again, seed users, we get 5 new users, each with 2 new documents. So that is our seeder. Pretty cool. There's a lot of different things that you can do with this. There's a lot of utility in this. It may seem silly to spend a lot of time writing something like this, but if you're working on an application long term, it's really, really a useful tool to have in your tool belt because the number of times that I've personally filled out forms is staggering, and I'm sure you've done the same thing, and it's a horrible experience to have to fill out forms constantly just to get test data. So something like this you can use to do that a little more dynamically in an automated process and save yourself some time. So hopefully this has been useful. Thanks for watching and thanks for reading the tutorial, and enjoy.